Hi there, good morning. Yes, the changes from today relate to people who are asymptomatic. So if you don't have symptoms, up until today, if you didn't have symptoms and you took a lateral flow test and it was positive, you then were told to go and take an additional PCR test. That's all changing from today. If you do have symptoms, you still need to take a PCR test. And the reason for this is quite simple. UK cases of COVID are just so high at the moment. We've got record high numbers in so many areas of the country. And really, if people are taking lateral flows and they're turning out to be positive, then because the cases are so high, it is most likely that the test will indeed be positive. And so there's no need for that additional confirmatory test to be taken. And that's really the reason why. I mean, the UK has got capacity to do 800,000 laboratory tests for PCRs. That's what they can do at their maximum. But the problem is, in December, we reached almost the capacity for those laboratory tests because they are, of course, more time-consuming to do. They take longer and they're more expensive. So that's why this initiative is sort of coming into place. But there's also been a change in understanding about lateral flows. I think initially they got perhaps maybe a little bit of bad press, and people were seen as they were sort of less reliable, less accurate. And really, they're quite different types of tests. And the UK Health Security Agency say lateral flows are actually the most effective for people who don't have symptoms. So they say there's an 80% accuracy in finding people with high viral loads who are most infections, and therefore those tests are best. And another benefit of this is there will also be a cut in the isolation period, because another problem that people were facing is they were having to go and get these PCR tests, and then the isolation period began from the day in which they get the result. So that is a contributing factor to so many staff absences at the moment. I mean, the sort of drawback really is some critics are saying that this process of having fewer people doing these PCR tests means that we will be not as a strong position to detect new variants.
OK, Alice, and I'm just looking at the front of the Daily Telegraph this morning. Their headline, Cabinet anger over misleading isolation guidance. And it does seem as though there is really increasing pressure to cut it from 7 to 5 days. Is that what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think we're getting kind of mixed messages from lots of different areas of the government, whether it comes to sort of isolation or indeed this issue of free lateral flow tests. I mean, on Sunday we had the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, sort of saying that, this discussion about whether free lateral flows will be stopped, he sort of said that's not going to happen. And then we got a slightly different picture from Michael Gove yesterday, who was sort of saying that it was impossible to predict how long lateral flows that would be free would be necessary. So we're getting a slightly mixed picture there. I mean, what we do know is back in November we had leaked Whitehall documents which effectively showed the government's sort of get out of COVID sort of strategy, and that was Operation Ramp Down, and that showed how the government would sort of get out of these additional benefits and strategies that they've put in place for the pandemic. And what that showed was there was indeed a plan at that point for what would happen if lateral flows were no longer free. So I think the question is not whether lateral flows will stop being free. It's the question of when, and the timing, of course, is incredibly political. As you were saying there's also lots of discussion about the isolation period as well. I mean, it was 10 days. It's now gone down to 7 days. We've seen in the US just before Christmas that was brought down to 5 days. And so there's a lot of pressure I think the government is getting certainly from some Conservative ministers to bring that down even further in line with the US.
It doesn't really matter what we're talking about if you can't get your hand on one of these, Alice. So what about availability? Because if we look back to Christmas time, there were real issues trying to get one of these tests. So with all that's going on, how likely is it the government's going to stop having these tests free? That's the $64,000 question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to say that Boris Johnson was actually asked about this yesterday in Uxbridge. I mean, I think he's still sort of keeping it open at the moment that lateral flows will be free, but he certainly said that they are looking at whether they could bring the isolation period down. This is what he had to say.
I think that we'll use them as long as they're very important, and there's a similar argument to be had about the quarantine period, whether to come down from 7 days to 5 days. The thing to do is to look at the science.
That was Boris Johnson speaking there. So you get sort of a feeling that they are looking at reducing the isolation period. I mean, it's interesting, as I'm sort of standing here in London, and we are sort of seeing perhaps the Omicron wave starting to sort of, it's perhaps had its peak at Christmas here, and it's starting to go down. And it's amazing to believe before Christmas about 1 in 20 people in London were infected with coronavirus. But the good news now is, as of London, 2 out of 3 boroughs are starting to see COVID cases decline. So that's the really, really good news. But there's still a lot of pressure on hospitals. We've got about 10,000 staff absences a day in London hospitals, and that's a real concern. But I think what's interesting is we're actually seeing perhaps a move out of London. And actually, if you look to the northwest of England, we're seeing a lot of hospitals which are declaring critical incidents due to staff shortages. But I think it begs really interesting questions, is that we're having staff in NHS hospitals who are they are absent. Often they're not that sick, they just have coronavirus, they're not too sick. And I think with all these staff shortages that we're seeing in place with people who aren't too sick, I think it raises some very interesting and important questions for the government